Donald Trump doesn't know what climate change is. He doesn't know what it means, doesn't understand how global temperatures change, and when it comes to net zero, conceptually, that's not something that he can manage.
Under Kamala's extreme high-cost energy policy known as net zero, you know what net zero, they have no idea what it means, by the way. It's net zero. What does that mean? Nobody knows. Ask her what it means. We're going to go to a net zero policy. What does that mean? I have no idea.
As a European living in the United States, I've always found it fascinating that despite being the second biggest polluter on the planet after China, the US doesn't really seem to talk about climate change with the same amount of guts and gusto as our European partners and neighbours. And even though they are smaller countries that do not pollute as much, they are so focused on bringing emissions down to net zero. And some countries have already managed it. In fact, Costa Rica is one of them. And so it's rather frightening that because climate change has been politicized so much in the United States, with Republicans referring to it as Democrat stuff, and so many Republican congresspeople and senators being climate change deniers, that there is simply no chance, in my view, of the rest of the country understanding quite what is at stake. Now, that is the kind of political discourse about climate change. Meanwhile, a record 15 national heat records have been broken since the start of this year, according to an influential climate historian, as weather extremes grow more frequent and climate breakdown intensifies. And an additional 130 monthly national temperature records have already been broken, along with tens of thousands of local highs registered at monitoring stations from the Arctic to the South Pacific. This is according to Maximiliano Herrera, who keeps an archive of extreme events. He said that the unprecedented number of records in the first 6 months was astonishing. He said this amount of extreme heat events is beyond anything we've ever seen or even thought possible before. The months from February to July this year have been the most record-breaking for every statistic. And here in the US, California experienced its hottest month on record in July as grueling heat baked the American West for weeks on end. The state's average temperature for the north was 81.7 Fahrenheit, that's 27.6 Celsius, according to the National Centers for Environmental Information. But some areas endured days of temperatures greater than 100 degrees Fahrenheit, 38 degrees centigrade. Several cities broke temperature records during the heat wave in early July. Palm Springs hit 124 on the 5th of July, while Redding, in the state's far north, saw a high of 119 degrees Fahrenheit on the 6th of July. Death Valley, the hottest place on Earth, recorded its hottest month ever in July, according to the National Park Service. In Nevada, Las Vegas reached 120 Fahrenheit on the 7th of July, its hottest day in history, and set a record for the number of days over 115 Fahrenheit. The impacts of extreme heat are being felt right across the US and the rest of the world as the climate crisis drives increasingly severe and dangerous weather conditions. Last month, around 1/3 of the US population was under warnings for record heat. The Earth saw its hottest day in recorded history on July 22nd this year, breaking a record set just 1 day earlier. Extreme heat poses major health risks and is the most deadly type of weather-related disaster. It's particularly dangerous for unhoused people and seniors, as well as those who don't have access to cooling spaces. And just a reminder that if you have a home with central air or air conditioning and you turn it on because you're trying to counteract the crazy heat outside, you are contributing to that heat because your air conditioning unit is putting out heat. It's putting out hot gas into the atmosphere. So really the idea that we could all just survive the climate crisis by turning on the AC defeats the object. It's only going to make the climate crisis worse. Meanwhile, the disgraced former president Donald Trump, alongside Elon Musk, made fact-free assertions about global heating, including that rising sea levels would create more oceanfront property and that there was no urgent need to cut carbon emissions during their event labelled the dumbest climate conversation of all time by one prominent activist. The Republican US presidential nominee Donald Trump and the world's richest person, Elon Musk, dwelled on the problem of the climate crisis during their much hyped conversation on Twitter, agreeing that the world has plenty of time to move away from fossil fuels, if at all. Trump said, "You sort of can't get away from it at this moment. I think we have, perhaps hundreds of years left. Nobody really knows." People do know. Scientists know. The calculations have been done. He said that rising sea levels caused by melting glaciers would have the benefit of creating more oceanfront property. Elon Musk, who owns a solar farm and electric car company, kind of kept quiet, whilst Trump, who famously once called the climate crisis a hoax, said that it was a disgrace that Joe Biden's administration did not allow drilling in Alaska, and claimed that farmers are having to give up their cattle because of climate rules, and that a far greater threat is posed by the prospect of nuclear war. He is insane, but the biggest problem, as I see it, is that people like him are lawmakers, and people who listen to him are lawmakers, and nobody seems to be listening to climate activists. And in fact, the only climate activist that anybody seems to be able to name is Greta Thunberg, who is young and enthused, but seems to spend much of her time locked up in a jail cell because she's always being arrested. Why is it that Donald Trump is walking free as a convicted felon and rapist, and Greta Thunberg, who is trying to warn us all of the climate crisis and the fact that if we don't do something about our emissions, then we're not going to have a planet to live on anymore, is the one sitting in a jail cell? It makes no sense to me. I just want to interrupt myself for a moment to ask you to support me and independent journalism by becoming a member of this YouTube channel. Click join just below. It starts at just $3 a month, and it would be really helpful because at the moment things have never been more complex and more dangerous with the rise of fascism and the fall of US democracy. So I'm going to do my best to put these messages and this analysis out every single day, but I really need your help to do that. If you don't want to join the YouTube channel and you're already on Patreon, you can sign up for my Patreon as well at patreon.com/5minute news. Thank you. With scientists warning of catastrophe beyond this point, the world faces the steep task of rapidly cutting emissions in half this decade and then to net zero by 2050 to avoid these worst impacts. Well, despite Donald Trump's claims of new beaches, sea levels are rising faster along the US coastline than the global average, with up to a foot of sea level rise expected in the next 30 years, an increase that equals the total rise seen over the past century. There are so many new technologies that enable us to harness the power of the sun and of wind and of waves. And if you don't like the sight of wind turbines and you'd rather just fry and die, then I don't really understand where you're coming from, because as far as I see it, we should be employing the Defense Production Act and putting everybody to work building wind turbines and solar farms right across the country, if not across the world. It should be like a scene out of a disaster movie where the comet is crashing to Earth and humans have to do something about it. Well, it's totally possible to do that. We have the know-how, we have the technology now to switch over completely to renewable energy, if we so choose. But unfortunately, so many kickbacks from the oil and gas industry to lawmakers, backhanders and cash transactions, lobbyists, prevent, certainly in the United States, any major shift. And for those that are interested in the technology, as I am, I want to introduce you to tidal stream energy generation. Currently, there is a system operating in the north of Scotland where the use of the current is turning huge turbine blades under the sea. And this is generating 10% of the electricity of the Isle of Orkney.
500 million tons of water at 10 miles an hour for 6 hours one way, 500 million 10 miles an hour 6 hours the other. Day in, day out, forever.
This is 2 megawatt, which is around 2,000 UK houses.
So how does it work? Let's go down under these legs, where we find turbine blades on each leg. Think wind turbine but underwater, rotating in the push of the tide, and that is basically it. Unlike solar, unlike wind, the tides never stop.
These are the types of things we should be investing in. It's incredible technology. We could have these all around the coastal regions of the United States, providing energy for local towns and cities. And yet, I don't really hear anybody talking about this kind of technology. Think about it. With investment, we'd see jobs, and we'd also see a sense of excitement and community about tackling the climate crisis. And whilst President Joe Biden has done a lot to try and reduce the United States' emissions on the global stage through the infrastructure bill and other policies, it's really not enough, and arguably doesn't come close to the kind of investment needed to really make the switch. And, instead of this kind of political bashing about electric cars and how, Republicans want to drive gas and drill, baby, drill, the reality is that the used electric car market is vast. You can get a beautiful electric car with a 300-mile range for just $15,000 to $25,000. You don't have to go brand new $50,000, $60,000, $70,000. And no one seems to be talking about the used market for EVs either. And I wish they were. So in this moment, approaching this election, it is essential that Kamala Harris is elected, as she is the only one of the two candidates that knows what climate change is, that is going to do anything about it, and most importantly, understands the concept of net zero.
What does that mean? I have no idea.
I'm Anthony Davis. You can catch me on the 5 Minute News YouTube channel and podcast, on Wednesdays co-hosting Uncovered, and on Sunday on The Weekend Show with Midas Touch.